good to have Dr. Robert Grossman, who, if he doesn't mind, I'm going to call Bob, on this Zoom conference. I generally am one for relatively hasty introductions, but when it comes to Bob, I got to tell you a bunch of stuff. This guy, he's a neurosurgeon, a neuroscientist who won awards for his work in multiple sclerosis, who's a radiologist who did pioneering work with magnetic resonance technology. He took over NYU Langone in 2007 when it had 7,000 employees and had revenues of about 2 billion. Today it has 40,000 employees and revenues of around 10 billion. It has 330 physical sites. He has been called a pathological optimist, which I think his work would help you understand. Now NYU Langone has 2 medical schools, tuition-free, both of them, which is historic. One of them is even named for him now, which is pretty amazing. There's just so much more, but this is a guy who's done a lot and who's got a lot to tell us. And of course, one of the main reasons we wanted to have Bob here today is that NYU Langone has been such a critical factor in New York and the country's response to the pandemic. It was a place where the pandemic hit very hard, very early. So we're going to get into a lot about that too. So welcome, Bob. You couldn't even shut me up from that long-winded introduction if you wanted to. So thank you again. So for this tremendous transformation you've done at this institution you've been leading now for 13 years, what would you say is the most important thing you did to make that huge set of changes? I mean, you've taken the company from like the 36th best, academic medical institution to the 3rd in the country. It's like and your medical school is right behind Harvard. You have done astonishing things, but what would you say, is it your optimism? What is it you've done differently?
Well, like everybody who's been successful, I've had, number one, a great partnership with Ken Langone, number one, critical. And number two, I have a great team of people. And when you have a world-class team and the greatest board chairman in the universe, you're very fortunate. And those 2 things really enabled us to do some astonishing things that you described.
Well, yeah, and Ken Langone, clearly unbelievable character in this story. And hiring you was one of his better moves, clearly. Okay, one of the things about your institution that I think this will lead us to the COVID conversation, but we talk at Techonomy about institutions being techonomic. And there's an astonishing book about you and NYU Langone, which came out not long ago, called World Class, written by Bill Hazeltine, who himself is a world-class medical researcher, a doctor, expert, leader. So the fact that he wrote it is impressive in itself. But one of the things this book talks so much about is your use of data and technology and being ahead of the curve and way beyond the way most American medicine uses data and technology. Talk a little bit about the importance of data in your work and why you've made that major move.
Yeah. So I'm a radiologist, I'm a neuroradiologist, and ran a department. And one of the things in radiology is very data driven, and it's easy to acquire data. And in 2007, when I was named dean, I asked a few questions, and the administrators at that time said, Bob, and they pointed to all these binders, and they said, it's going to take us some months to get through that. And I said to myself, oh, I'm dead. I am dead, because I said it's like flying a 747 without controls.
This is what they wanted for you to brief yourself on the data about that?
They wanted to make an excuse that they couldn't answer the simple questions I posed in real time, because it was the process of going through paper data and charts was just overwhelming. And so I said that we're going to create an electronic dashboard. And then I didn't get a lot of buy-in. And one of the things I did, and I think this is important for leaders, I organized all the people who own the data and the IT person, because the people who own the data really want to keep the data because that's their power.
Right.
Right. And so I organized all the people, and actually I got rid of the IT person, put another IT person in charge who really understood the concept. And he's a fantastic person, Nader Marabi. And we would meet every month to go over the dashboard. But I didn't have any of the members of my team there, because as soon as you put more members of the team, some people want it this way, some people want it this way, some people want it this way. And so
keeping them out was a strategy. Yeah.
Exactly. So for me, I wanted my dashboard. And it had to be the way I thought about it, what was important to me, et cetera. And we worked on it. It took 2 years. And then the first thing I did, I presented it to the chairs meeting. And chairs of medical school departments are a little persnickety. And the first thing that happened was when the chair of surgery, who was a great guy, said, "Bob, the data's wrong." And I said, "Well, Leon, it's in your court to fix it." So I wanted to put the monkey on the chair's back. And I said, this is going to be the only source of data. We're not having Excel spreadsheets, shadow data, et cetera. And it took about 15 minutes. Everybody got the idea. And that was about 2009. And we built this amazing contemporaneous dashboard, which has over 800 items on it. And just as a point of information, our data was so good about COVID that the members of the White House staff had me emailing it to them every day to really understand what was going on in New York.
Wow. So the dashboard includes both big picture data as well as very granular data about, give us an example of the kind of things that you have.
It has everything. It has every mission. Yeah, it has education, research, and clinical care. So I can tell you the complications of any surgeon at any time, how long they take in the operating room, how long a case gets delayed. I can tell you the reason why each operating case gets delayed. So just to make a point, how that particular bit of information drives performance. Our turnaround time in operating rooms is about 30 minutes. If you compare us to other well-known New York hospitals, their operating turnaround time is about 1.5 hours, 2 hours.
And that what accounts for that?
Well, because the data, everybody sees the data. So we understand all the parts to the delays, and we put it up. And so there's transparency created across the institution. And another example, this was a good example. When we first developed the dashboard, we looked at length of stay. Now, in 2007, when I started, I did a regression analysis of what was associated with hospital margin. Very simple. And at the time, I think they said it in the book, we were making, at the best year, NYU Langone made $30 million. Most years it didn't make any money. And I said, well, let's understand what's associated with hospital margin. And you do a regression. This was crude, but it made a lot of sense. And it came out, the most important parameter associated with hospital margin was length of stay. And that made a lot of sense because in most of the insurance cases, you get paid for an episode of care. So if the
In other
episode,
words, the longer they stayed, the more money you made.
no, the less money you make.
Opposite? Okay.
You see,
For we
you get
patients, it's
paid a
complete-
lump sum if they stay 1 day or if they stay 20 days.
Oh, I see. Oh, good. So getting them healthy is the key thing. That's going to
Well,
make more money.
well, imputed into length of stay is complications,
Right.
right? So if you have complications, they cost money because you're not getting paid and you're, okay. And length of stay requires, it means somebody's occupying that bed and somebody else would be in that bed. So things like that. So if you looked at cardiac surgery, which has very high DRGs, in other words, the hospital makes a lot of money on them, and you graft the length of stay with each surgeon, what you found, it was like a scatter plot. It had nothing to do with anything. So we showed it to all the cardiac surgeons. And all of a sudden, everybody wanted to regress to the lowest length of stay.
Uh-huh. That's the kind of
And so the
composition.
behavioral economics of it is fascinating. You just show the data. And we do this all the time in surgery and in medicine. And we have elaborate ways of showing how each person compares with the other person within departments who do the same thing and across departments. And that drove unbelievable behavior and change.
Well, they say you can't improve what you don't measure. So clearly you've proven.
Exactly.
But let's go right to COVID. How did that help you in your extraordinary progress, which you made in your hospital with coping with this incredible assault that we experienced?
Right. Okay. So there are two things about our culture. One, it's a very metrically driven culture. One is that there are not a lot of layers. We have very, our administrative overhead is pretty low, but it enables us to communicate rapidly across all the hospitals, across all divisions and everything. It's sort of part of that dashboard.
You have 6 hospitals, right? That you
Well, we have actually, we have a hospital in Brooklyn, we have Winthrop Hospital in Long Island, we have Tisch Kimmel is basically one hospital, and NYU Langone Orthopedic Hospital. But if you're talking about real full hospitals, there are 3.
Okay.
Okay. So but everybody was at the table for all the discussions. So any observation was implemented immediately across the entire system.
Yeah.
So
right.
we figured out pretty early, very early in fact, actually it was from an observation in Winthrop, an autopsy, that patients were having microthrombi.
What does that mean?
They were having small clot. I think people.
Coagulation and clotting.
Yeah, clotting. So that, much later you heard about it, but we saw it really early. We put patients on anticoagulants.
When was that?
Really, really early. So that was part of it. The second, so communication across the entire system enabled us to implement therapies that people wouldn't have heard about. Also, problems percolated very rapidly. So another example was that, and this was going on in Brooklyn and in Winthrop, that there was such intensity of demand for oxygen that, so you have these liquid oxygen tanks and they go into a vaporizer and then goes to the hospital. Well, the demand was so great that the vaporizers were freezing.
Wow.
So you couldn't deliver the oxygen. So we figured that out. We had second oxygen tanks, second pipes, things
but again,
like
the data
that.
was what allowed you to respond quicker to that.
Extreme agility. And then we knew what was happening throughout the entire system at all times. So we were able to load balance the hospitals. So we could transfer patients between every hospital virtually automatically.
Wow.
And that's huge.
Yeah.
So the data and the communication and the culture really enabled us in a very intense and hectic time to keep our head above water.
So I think it would be useful for you to just summarize where you think we are, the United States, with COVID, and specifically what you've learned by being on the front lines, because you were on the front lines of the most aggressive assault.
Right. Okay, so let me start where we are today. So let me first say that I don't think we know as much as we should know about COVID. Okay, let's be very honest here that you know, there are still some really difficult, I'd say fundamental questions that we don't understand, and I'll get to that in a moment. But where we are, so if you look at the death rates in the United States, they've come down. We understand what therapies are better and what therapies don't work. So the things that we learned early on were, number one, proning makes a big difference. Putting the patients on their bellies created the ability to ventilate patients better before even they got intubated. So that's a big thing, right?
Okay.
Number two, you wanted to use high flow nasal oxygen as opposed to intubating patients, because when you intubate patients, you paralyze them, and it takes a long time for them to get off the ventilators. Whereas if you can keep them off the ventilators, they tend to do better. Number three, probably there is an effect, some effect with IL-6 inhibitors, and some effect maybe with remdesivir around the edges, clearly.
These are treatment drugs.
Yeah, some treatments, right? So I think those were the big, and anticoagulation.
Yeah, which is, for the common parlance person like me, that's only really sunk in recent weeks, that the reason people have COVID foot and they have liver, kidney, heart problems is because you don't know where it's going to coagulate, but you're basically having clotting that shouldn't be happening.
Right, so you're having microvascular clots, and you saw that in the big, became very apparent in the kidneys.
Yeah,
where people were going into renal failure because they were having these clots in the capillaries and in the veins. Okay, so those were, I think, the mainstays of the therapy. The second thing we understood was that there were cohorts of patients who didn't do well, and there were cohorts of patients who did better.
Did your data help you figure out what characterized each of those?
Yeah, so we think, so there was a paper early on by the senior author Leora Harwitz, which was in the British Medical Journal, and there were some inflammatory markers like ferritin and other inflammatory markers that were negatively predictive, and obviously age had a negative prediction, and body habitus. It was interesting that patients, and this was fascinating, African-American patients who got to our hospitals did the same when you when you normalize for all the conditions, that did as well as patients who are white. So that was a very interesting finding.
That's good.
Yeah, very interesting. But what we, so we understood again that not intubating patients probably improved the outcome. And then I think the other issue was how, so you had the patients in the hospitals and then how to get them home. And that was a little bit challenging because a lot of them, COVID had a much more profound, so we learned that it was not like the flu. It had a much more profound effect because it affected many more organ systems and people were very weak leaving the hospital, some of the older people. And it also affected all these organs that we learned about. And some of it was on a microvascular basis, but some of it were other things. And yeah, I don't know, it's recently been written, you see all the cardiac issues after COVID vaccine and things like that.
Right.
So we learned all those things. We also learned that no matter how much you prepare for something, you can't always be prepared because we were pretty prepared for COVID. Actually, interestingly enough, we had done a whole emergency drill on a virus in January.
Wow.
And early on, this was in February, early February, I said I wanted to be sure we had 6 months supply chain of all the things we needed. So we bulked up on that. And then I stopped travel at the end of February. So we were pretty prepared for—
We're ahead of the curve.
Well,
listen, I want to step back, and I think our mutual friend Jim McCann may join us here in a second, but what is your general feeling about whether we're going to be able to blick this thing in a reasonable time? I know one of the things that's happening at NYU Langone is a major amount of research on vaccines. So talk to me and to Jim now about what do you think is going to happen next?
Yeah, so I think as they said, a pathological optimist. I think there's going to be a vaccine or multiple vaccines. There are several pathways to developing a vaccine. One pathway is using synthetic messenger RNA and putting it in liposomes and vaccinating that way. And that's what the Moderna trial is and the Pfizer trial. Both of those use mRNA. The Oxford AstraZeneca trial, which actually we're going to do we did the Pfizer phase 1, phase 2. We're going to do the AstraZeneca phase 3, Oxford AstraZeneca, which is a chimp adenovirus, which has the spike protein on it. So you're immunizing against this adenovirus. And the elegance of it is we're already immune to human adenovirus, but chimp adenovirus, we have no immunity. So that's a wonderful way to create this immunity and T-cell immunity. And I think the Oxford group has shown that. And then the other thing, which people don't talk about, so those are the 3 vaccines. There are a lot of vaccines, but those are the 3 vaccines that I know something about. And then the other thing that's very interesting is this monoclonal antibody developed by Lilly. So a monoclonal antibody is effectively, when people get the disease, they develop antibodies, and they have a host of antibodies. And when you give serum back, you're giving all the serum. When you concentrate, the serum is called hyperimmune, like hyperimmune gamma globulin. Well, this is a synthetic antibody against the viral spike protein that could be very useful in nursing homes, in elderly patients who may not develop an immune response. And it could also be a bridge between developing and certifying a vaccine and what we have now. So I'm sort of very optimistic about that as well.
I know we've only got a couple minutes, but Jim, chime in on what you'd like here.
Sure, Doctor. It's my I'm a fan.
Thank you,
Dr. Bob Grossman. I get to work with him a little bit on the Board of Overseers.
And I appreciate your support.
And back, Doc, in April, at the conclusion of a board meeting, there were just a few of us left on the call, and I asked you to look out into the future because that's what you're so good at. You take data, you look into the future, and you say, how are things likely to change? And would you just share with our audience here some of the things you said? I remember your forecast around telemedicine, which has turned out to be spot on. Your forecast about private practice and its future. You talked about this COVID pandemic of being a great accelerator, some trends that were already visible, telemedicine. And another one you mentioned was maternity. Because at NYU Langone Winthrop on Long Island, they had to set up a maternity facility separate. They created a separate ambulatory care facility into maternity. And you said, maybe maternity never returns to the hospital. How will we think? The term hospital means different things to all of us, but essentially the same. How might the term hospital be different in the future?
Yeah, I think it's going to be all good questions, and we think about them a lot. So I think hospitals are changing dramatically. So there is an imperative to shift from inpatient to ambulatory. Inpatient is more expensive, ambulatory is less expensive. Inpatient is much more intense, but today with minimally invasive procedures, we just did, as a matter of fact, a total hip in an ambulatory surgery 3.5 hours out of the hospital. Wow. So I'm looking at Langone Orthopedic Hospital and I'm saying, how many beds do we need?
How much footage don't you need?
Yeah, exactly. So number one, so I think ambulatory centers, and our business model has always been to create these ambulatory care centers all over New York, as opposed to bringing everybody into the hospital. The second thing, going back to electronic medicine, is that there are going to be a lot of encounters that are going to be electronic. So you're going to have a hybrid model, right? So the question is, how much real estate do you need?
And by the way, under your leadership, in the last 10 years, I would say that you built 10 million square feet of facilities?
Exactly, yep, exactly. So the real estate, and then one of the things that kill you in an era of declining payments, and I'm worried, but one of my concerns is that with the economy as it is and people losing jobs and losing insurance, in order to maintain any P&L, you have to be able to control your expenses. And how you leverage electronics is very important. So for instance, in our ambulatory sites, we have something called Checkmate. So Checkmate is when you check in, we have it built like airports. So instead of having a person check in, we have an electronic encounter platform. And that enabled us to eliminate a lot of FTEs.
Wow.
And we've done that across the entire system. And so we have invested in IT, in anything that could produce a profit without impairing patient care.
Well, this is so impressive. We wish we could go all day. We've got to wrap. But you know, the thing that amazes me about what you've done, Bob, and Jim, your partnership as part of it, and thank you for helping bring this to my attention too. The data-centric approach you've taken, which has really been applied to helping people get better faster, as Bill Hazeltine explains in World Class, is really a model for the country that we all need to learn from, because everybody knows our national system needs to be way more efficient. So thank you for creating that model. Thank you for coming to join us today. And Jim, thank you for helping us with this whole process, and keep up the great work, Bob. And
Thank
we'll
you.
hope that things don't get worse. I think they're going to get better.
David, the secret that will be told is that inspired leadership like Ken Langone and Dr. Grossman, and they're one of 4 major health systems in the New York City area. A great financial exposure and expense. Those 4 health systems saved the New York metropolitan area during this crazy COVID time. And what you're saying exactly is correct. How do we take the learning and the knowledge that Dr. Grossman and his amazing team and the other 4 hospitals, the other 3 hospital systems too, and make that a national platform that's national learning all at the same time. And it's all going to be through data and data sharing.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you again, Bob.
Yes,
Okay.
thanks, Bob.